It's been a contentious few weeks in Marvel Snap. Let's check out the best of your hot takes. Shang-Chi isn't a problem. People just want to play solitaire instead of running tech cards to protect their board. I think this is a little bit reductive, but I generally agree with the premise, which is that when there is a discussion of Shang-Chi, it tends to hinge around this idea of sandcastles, that you can't have a game in which players can build their own sandcastle if the number one card is a sandcastle kicker like Shang-Chi. But I think that a little bit misunderstands what building sandcastles really means and what it's actually about. And what I mean by that is, I think it's actually important for people to grasp that in a world without a reasonable tech card like Shang-Chi keeping extremely large things down, there is a metagame purely of who can have the largest thing. You don't want there to just be sandcastles and then whoever has the biggest sandcastle wins the game. That's kind of not how you want it to be. And we actually have some of this dynamic in the game currently, and really have ever since the Living Tribunal deck really took off, where it was just like, okay, in a world where people are playing mid-range decks, you answer those mid-range decks with things like Hela that are hard to interact with and go very tall. And in a world where everyone is playing Hela, you just simply play a bigger combo deck. And ideally, that's just a thing we don't want to happen, which is why it's so interesting that like this stuff tends to get kept in check some of the time. I think that Shang-Chi is actually a card that does not do as much, say, as other cards in terms of really policing that metagame. I think, a great example would be Enchantress keeping Living Tribunal down, various things keeping various magic decks down. Other cards do that as well, but I think as a baseline discussion of what is actually happening in the metagame, Shang-Chi generally does good things for it. Now, do I think it has to cost 4? Honestly, I probably don't. Do I think it should cost something else? I honestly don't think it does. Or needs to. I would say right now that I think Shang-Chi is more a force for good than he is a force for bad, but I certainly don't begrudge people not liking him kind of just being everywhere, right? I don't have any objection to that. I do think he's, moderately overplayed considering. But I think that generally speaking, there is nothing wrong with having a card like Shang-Chi be what defines your meta, because it allows for the restrictions within which a meta evolves, right? You have these meta games that are built around, I'm going to create a lot of points but not be vulnerable to Shang-Chi. When you build a deck like that, it ends up being very vulnerable to things like Hela, which are also blanking Shang-Chi because you're not often going to be able to get good targets off of it like that. And I think that dynamic is genuinely interesting. If that gets boring, I can see thinking about a shakeup to Shang-Chi, but right now, no, I think he's pretty good. Second Dinner should release weaker cards for gold, only that they normally couldn't sell as normal cards in a big bundle, like 10 cards that are all fringe for like 5k gold. I love this. This should absolutely happen. I think one of the things that really strikes me about the way Second Dinner does, not necessarily balance, but card release schedules, is it's very hard for them to release a card that would be an uncommon in Magic the Gathering, because they all get released at a price point of the same effective price point, right? Like, we don't really see any Series 4s anymore. These are all coming out at Series 5, and that means they have to compete with the best of the best at that price point. So there's a question of, like, how do you ever release a card that is just something you think would be cool to have in the game, but is not necessarily pushed to be either incredibly exciting or incredibly good? It's just like, oh, okay, I think this would be a good thing to have in the game. It almost, I won't say it limits design space in the sense of, like, everything has to be big and exciting, but it probably does have an impact. And I think a way to release cards like that would not only be good for card acquisition. Obviously, I think a lot of people would love getting more cards for less, right? Like, that kind of goes without saying. The number one complaint about Marvel Snap that I think I hear is, this game's too expensive, and I totally buy that. Now, is this necessarily the solution? I don't know, but it's good that we're thinking about it, I think. I think it's good that things are progressing in a direction where we can think about alternate ways to release cards. Is that actually a viable pitch? Like, if I brought that to Second Dinner and I was like, you should do this, would there be any way for anyone I brought it to go to their boss and say, this would make us more money? I doubt it, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about, and obviously I'd be in favor of it if that could be a thing that could happen. No one being mad about Jeff's crazy play rate is objectively hilarious. How could you be mad at him? He's just a little guy. And I actually responded to this one on Twitter. It's so sick that he's in like 50% of games and everyone's just like, dope. And I think this really illustrates one thing for me, which is that like people sort of, I don't really know the right way to say this because I know it's a human thing and I know I do it too. So I don't want this to seem like a call out post because it's very much just like, this is baseline human action to do. But one thing that people do is they'll point to a thing that can be construed as bad in one context and say that it is undeniably bad and then not have that same energy for another context, right? And so with Shang-Chi versus Jeff, I mean, that is like a real conversation, right? Where you're just like, okay, when you look at these two cards, they're both ubiquitous, but one is free to play and the other one isn't. And I think that should matter a lot more than it does in the discussion. And I think the second thing with Jeff is he's just less offensive. It's not because he's a little shark guy. If Jeff was the guy who was making it so you couldn't win games, people would hate him just as much. But Jeff is played as a utility piece. He's not that, he's just like good, but he's not like, oh my God, I cannot deal with this guy in my games. He's a 2-3, right? Nobody's really going to get mad at that, right? He's not stopping you from doing anything. And I think, generally speaking, I am sympathetic to the idea that he is a far less offensive card to have be your number one card in the game. But at the same time, it's like, okay, this is by far the best 2-drop in the game. It has been in Series 5 the entire time and will probably never not be in Series 5. And at some point, maybe you start to wonder if that's a little bit offensive, don't you? Your friendship with Glenn Jones is the downfall of us all. I mean, I think it is very generous to describe us in those terms. My friendship with Glenn Jones extends to I have had him on my podcast twice and on my YouTube channel twice. But you'd think like, oh, that's 4 times you've had him on. You've asked him to do this 4 times. Wrong. He just stays late after the podcast to do the YouTube video. So it's like, you know, my friendship with Glenn Jones, I'm someone who's typically like a little bit worried about describing things in those terms because I don't really know how other people feel about me. I'm not very good at reading it. Definitely reading this out loud makes me think that I'm going to get a message from Glenn Jones, be like, hey man, we aren't friends. X-Mansion location should give players 2 random cards, but of the same cost. No-brainer fix. Unfortunately, I think this actually is a brainer, right? Because you're going to end up with a bunch of these situations where it is going to be just as unequal, but like the idea that like all the stuff at the same cost is like roughly equivalent, like it's a little bit iffy, right? Like you're still going to end up with a bunch of situations where like someone gets Taskmaster and the other person gets Spider-Woman just off the top of my head. Like the higher up the costs go, the more like weird conditional garbage there is there. Like, oh, I got a Tuma. I guess I just instantly lose this location, right? Like, and all that still exists. But what I'm saying is I don't actually think it would alleviate the bad feelings associated with that location. I think the bad feelings associated with that location are what they are, and making it like X% less swingy is not going to make it feel any better when your opponent gets a free 9 power and you get 0. And that will still happen a lot. So it's like, I think, honestly, there's an argument that would make it feel worse. Because you're like, oh my God, think about how unlucky I had to be to get this outcome even after they fixed it. I don't think that's the fix for X-Mansion, personally. Apocalypse is in the same state as old Chavez. You don't run it to ever actually play the card. It's just food for Dracula. No card should be put in a deck to simply never be played like old Chavez. I think this is a little bit of a misunderstanding of why old Chavez was an issue on 2 levels. The first is, you might not be putting Apocalypse in the deck to play it, but it is a card you absolutely want to draw, and your game plan absolutely interacts with it. Having that Dracula getting bigger and bigger, yeah, you're not actually playing the card Apocalypse, but it doesn't work without Apocalypse. You have this Lady Sif in there to hit Apocalypse. You are drastically attempting to engage with what this card does throughout your entire game plan. That's not what Chavez was. You weren't engaging with Chavez in a meaningful way in any deck that played her. You were engaging with the other 11 cards in the deck in a more meaningful way. And I know someone's going to get on here and be like, well, actually, Chavez was a buff to Lockjaw decks because you'd get her out of the deck. And it's like, yes, but that's not really the same thing, is it? And I think the other thing that Chavez did that I'm not sure they like super want to talk about, but makes a lot of sense to me to get rid of that kind of effect in a game is like, if you're in the business of selling cards and you have 12 slots in a deck, making it so they only have 11 slots in a deck is probably bad for business. And I think if you wanted to make an argument for nerfing something like Shang-Chi or especially Jeff, that would be the argument I would make. Where it's like, look, this card is taking up slots in decks that you could otherwise be selling cards for. And I think America Chavez doing that was a thing. And I think, but more than that, it was even on the merits of the explanation they gave, if you assume that wasn't a factor at all, Apocalypse is not meeting that standard in either of these cases. There has never been a good meta in Marvel Snap. People coalesce around a few meta decks, and the only place we see any meaningful diversity is Proving Grounds and Silver Conquest. In order to see real deck building and matchup diversity, we need a draft mode. I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what card games are and what metagames are. The idea that there has never been a good metagame because people play good decks is like, it's not even backwards. It's just, that's what a metagame is. Like, a metagame refers to the interplay between the dominant or optimal strategies in the game. And whether or not that takes place, like there's no way for that not to take place. That's not a thing you can avoid. You cannot avoid there being several good decks that are better than the ones that are not. You cannot avoid that in a game of cards. That is how it works. And I think the idea that because metagames exist, there has never been a good one is, I don't buy that at all. And I think you talk about like the only way this could not happen is a draft mode. And it's like, you know, metagames exist in draft formats too, where it's about like how, like what specific cards you got offered and like what the general strategies you go in. If you look into like how Magic drafting works and especially how they design for draft, they have like these cards that are like signpost, like uncommons for the archetype you're meant to play in the draft. Like it's not on rails, but it's like they want you to figure out how these decks match up into each other and why. And I think the idea that draft doesn't have a metagame is insane to me. And I think similarly, the idea that diversity is the same thing as a good metagame is also insane to me. To me, what I enjoy about a metagame is whether or not the games are fun. Like, that's really what matters. And yeah, diversity helps extend like the lifespan of that, like the freshness of it. But it's not like the only thing that matters when evaluating a metagame. I think restrictive deck building would go a long way for random balance anomalies. An example from way back when would be Leader can't be in a deck with Aero, or Shuri can't be in a deck with Red Skull. They have a way to balance, but mostly they neuter cards for it. I think I disagree with this, because I think the premise of a card game as a whole is we give you these pieces and we give you the freedom to put them together, right? And I think if you start saying, you know, for balance reasons, we can't let you play these two pieces together, that sort of breaks the promise of a card game, right? It's your job as a developer to make it so those pieces can be played together and it's not too bad. And I think that is, when you start adding text onto here, and I realize this is a little hypocritical because I'm the guy who was like, you know, you should just put the text on Thanos, that's on Mockingbird that says no Thanos stones, right? I get it. But I think that's like a quick fix, right? And I was proposing it in the context of we need a quick fix for this and then we'll figure it out later. I don't think you can actually just do that. I think that like if that is your balanced strategy, it ends up breaking the promise of a card game. And if you're going to break the promise of a card game, you need to do it for something more than this deck has 55% win rate, because you have other ways to fix that, right? Like, there needs to be something super compelling if you're going to start breaking the promise of a card game. And I can't think of anything that would really meet that demand to me. Everyone should snap first round of Proving Grounds and leave if they lose. We have Silver, Gold, and Infinity. Don't make me sit for 7 rounds on Proving Grounds just to get, or even not get, a silver ticket. Objectively correct. This is a factually based take. I think one thing people don't really consider about, you know, the conquest communism, snapping and Proving Grounds, whatever you want to call it, is the tickets and their cost in gold Proving Grounds exists as an artificial gateway to justify the prices that are attached to the other tickets. The more we work together as players to bypass this artificial gateway, the cheaper the game becomes for everyone because there's real rewards at the end of Conquest. You get stuff in the shop, you get free stuff, and you can make that stuff free by effectively generating infinite silver tickets. This can help everyone make these artificial barriers that are placed on that, money effectively that would be free or could be free if they weren't there. Whenever you don't snap in Proving Grounds, basically, you're helping the man. That's what I'm getting at here. You should not be helping the man. You should not be helping Second Dinner make money. They make so much money on their own. Please, 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 please snap in Proving Grounds and just claw this little bit of power back. You feel me? The OG Aero 5556 moves everything. Wouldn't be neither broken nor unfun today. All right, ignoring the double negative, I think that this is correct. And what you're saying is, 5-6 moves everything, wouldn't be broken. I agree. There are a lot more decks today that are like really filling up everything. And a lot of old Aero's power was predicated on wave preventing your opponents from really playing cards. So Aero would always be moving like the one thing they actually did play over to the lane where it didn't matter. Yeah, I think you could do this. Is it necessary to do this? That I don't know. Is it fun to do this? I don't know. But I do think it could be a relatively balanced card, yes. Roman should have retained. I'm a huge fan of our tribal chief, but I do think at some point when you have a run like that, it is time to hand the reins over, no pun intended. Not necessarily to the next generation, because I think Cody's probably from the same generation, but it is important that when you end a reign like that, it matters. And I think last time when Roman won, it really signaled to everyone watching, like, okay, look, Roman's going to keep the title until next WrestleMania. What is even the point of this? And I think doing that again feels just so pointless. When you have a reign like that going, it's only really going to end at WrestleMania. And I think the pressure of that on another year of daily television would just make it a little bit unwatchable. And I think part of the reason people were so excited for this is because finally it's actually over. Now, obviously, I acknowledge our tribal chief, and I have no shame in saying that, but I think it probably was time. I'm obviously excited to see what he does in the future. And, he's been, the guy. For real. I was a guy who really hated Roman Reigns, and now I'm a guy who really likes Roman Reigns. All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed that look at your hot takes. I had a ton of fun doing this. It's actually been a little while since I did it. As a reminder, just because it's been a little while, please do like and subscribe if this is the kind of stuff you want to see from me. I have always been trying to figure out exactly how much or how well these videos are received. So, let me know in the comments. I obviously still read all of them. And of course, next time I do a hot takes video, make sure you get your hot take in on Twitter. Unfortunately, that is the place I use for hot takes because that's where it's easiest for me to keep track of them all and take screenshots. So next time you want a hot takes video, I usually post it like the day before, a couple days before on Twitter. You'll be able to leave your hot takes there. I know the YouTube viewers have them. Thank you so much. As always, I've been KM Best. No KM boost this time. I don't know if you got boosted from listening to me talk. I think that's a little bit arrogant to say that you did, but thank you so much for making it through the video.